Hi, welcome back to Theological Thoughts. This week I'm just having a look at, or some thoughts about the current pandemic we're in. Because a lot of people are, all like, is this the sign of the times, of the end of the world, is Jesus coming back, etc, etc. And yeah, it's pretty weird times, it's unusual for us, nothing like this in our lifetime has ever happened. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the end of the world. As I was thinking about this topic, one verse sprung to my mind straight away, and it's Psalm 23. It says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me." I'm sure it's familiar to many people. Maybe it does feel a little bit like we're walking through the valley of the shadow of death at the moment, with all the death tolls rising around the world and the coronavirus running rampant, it seems. But as the psalmist says, "I fear no evil, for God is with us and comforts us." That doesn't necessarily mean we won't die or get sick, but that no matter what is happening around us, internally we should be at peace and have a stilled mind, not one filled with worry or hopelessness. Even Jesus himself said when he was about to depart, he said, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. So do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid." And obviously as well, not to mention in Matthew 6 when he says about not worrying about what we'll eat or wear and things like that, especially during a time of panic buying and where shops and places are facing a lot of food shortages. There's a lot in the Bible that tells us about not worrying, relying on God. He's our strength and comfort, no matter what's going on around us in the world. So we need to keep that in mind, especially like Isaiah says in Isaiah 41, "Do not fear, for I am with you, and do not be dismayed, for I am your God." And again, Paul writes to Timothy, saying, "God has not given us a spirit of fear, but rather of power." So these things are in there. They're there to comfort us. We shouldn't be fear mongering and giving in to the panic. And Christians have faced plagues throughout history. I mean, they're not a new thing to this world. And by comparison, coronavirus is pretty mild in the grand scheme of things. I mean, other Black Death, things like that, they were huge, wiped out most of Europe. And I'll put a link to an infographic in the description of the video. You can have a look at to see just the scale of different pandemics and plagues throughout history. And the only difference in recent times, in 20th century prior, is that we have the modern medicine and the vaccines have improved to such a degree that we are fairly well protected against most things. Let alone pandemics happening again, or even on an epidemic level, they're still fairly rare, comparatively speaking. Sickness is often relegated to temporary inconvenience during the winter times now, with the flu season and things like that. So we just go and buy pills for. In past times of plague and disease, many people would flee their towns and cities if they weren't obviously sick to try and escape the looming deadly virus. But the Christian communities had the opposite reaction. They stayed with the sick and dying. In the year 249 AD, a pandemic swept the Roman Empire known as the Plague of Cyprian, named in commemoration of Cyprian the Bishop of Carthage, as he was a witness to it. At the height of the outbreak, it was thought that around 5,000 people a day were dying, and it almost toppled the empire. Cyprian wrote about the plague in his On Mortality book, describing its symptoms, some of which modern historians think could describe a type of Ebola. So I'll read a little quote from him. "This trial, now the bowels relaxed into constant flux, discharged the bodily strength. That fire originated in the marrow, ferments into wounds of the forces, that the intestines are shaken with a continual vomiting, that the eyes are on fire with the injected blood, that in some cases the feet or some parts of the limbs are taken off by the contagion of disease, putrefaction, that from the weakness arising by the maiming and loss of the body, either the gait is enfeebled, or the hearing is obstructed, or the sight darkened. I mean, that sounds pretty gruesome. But a couple of chapters later, Cyprian writes in praise of those who forsook their own well-being for the sake of others who were in need during this trying time. And he says, and further, beloved brethren, what is it that a great thing it is? What a great thing it is, how pertinent, how necessary, that the pestilence and plague which seems horrible and deadly searches out the righteousness of each one, and examines the mind of the human race to see whether they who are in health tend the sick. And around the year 260, Dionysius the Great, who was the patriarch of Alexandria, wrote in one of his letters about the plague, describing how badly the heathens treated their sick in contrast to the Christians. He says, but among the heathen all was the very reverse. But they thrust aside any who began to be sick, and kept aloof even from their dearest friends, and cast the sufferers out upon the public roads half dead, and left them unburied, and treated them with utter contempt when they died, steadily avoiding any kind of communication and intercourse with death, which, however, it was not easy for them altogether to escape, in spite of the many precautions they employed. So Dionysius praised the Christian community for not abandoning the sick and dying, but for living out the gospel and a Christ-centered mindset, by going to help the ill at the expense of their own lives. I'll quote his full paragraph, because I think it shows truly the impact of living out the command to love your neighbour. He says, certainly, very many of our brethren, while in their exceeding love and brotherly kindness, they did not spare themselves, but kept each other, and visited the sick without thought of their own peril, and ministered to them assiduously, and treated them for their healing in Christ, died from time to time most joyfully alongside with them, laden themselves with pains derived from others, drawing up upon themselves their neighbours' diseases, unwillingly taking over to their own persons the burden of the sufferings of those around them. And many who had thus cured others of their sicknesses and restored them to strength, died themselves, having transferred to their own bodies the death that lay upon these. In the times that we live in, that's quite a challenge in itself. And Eusebius, in his church history, also chronicles the efforts of Christians during the plague, and notes how selflessly they acted in the face of death. He says, for they alone in the midst of such ills showed their sympathy and humanity by their deeds. Every day some continued caring for and burying the dead, for there were multitudes who had no one to care for them. Others collected in one place those who were afflicted by the famine throughout the entire city, and gave bread to them all, so that the thing became reported abroad among all men. And they glorified the God of the Christians, and convinced by the facts themselves, confessed that they alone were truly pious and religious. So it was this level of Christ-centered, self-sacrificing love for all people, regardless of age, race or religion, that made even the pagan critics of Christianity sit up and take notice. The Emperor Julian in 362 AD wrote about how the atheists, which in those days meant Christians, or anyone who denied the Roman gods, demonstrated better virtue and benevolence than his own people and his own priesthood, and to their shame, because Christians not only looked after their own communities, but the wider population and strangers as well. So while this next quote I'm going to read isn't specifically about a time of pestilence or plague, it shows a good example of the attitude of Christians in just even normal times, and that their attitude during a plague was no exceptional thing, but just an outworking of the standard Christian life and living and attitude. So he wrote, why do we not observe that it is their benevolence to strangers, their care for the graves of the dead, and their pretended holiness of their lives that have done most to increase atheism in Christianity? I believe that we ought really and truly practice every one of these virtues. It is not enough for you alone to practice them, speaking to his priest, or high priest I think, but so must all the priests of Galatia, without exception, for it is disgraceful that when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Galileans, the Christians, support not only their own poor, but ours as well, all men see that our people lack aid from us. So you're a little bit salty about that. So just to round off quickly, at the end of this, so it doesn't go on for too long. The whole purpose of all these quotes and things is to show that this is how Christians should be thinking and acting during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. We should be having self-sacrificial love and love of our neighbour. With the whole debates going on about wearing masks and violating your rights and things, it's just nonsense. I mean, if masks help protect our neighbours from getting the illness, then wear a mask. It's the Christ-like thing to do. I mean, even maybe go as far as to say, even if the science isn't there on that in some ways, I mean, I've heard both sides, I don't know, the better to err on the side of caution and just wear one for the sake of other people, even if it makes them feel safer. Surely that's more loving to do. We shouldn't be getting into all the politics of masks or anything like that, being like, oh, it violates my rights. We have no rights. We give our rights away. We are Christians. We are dead to this life. We are alive in Christ. Our life is not our own, it's His. So we should be doing what Christ would want, what would be best for other people, not ourselves. And if you don't like wearing a mask, suck it up, basically. If for some reason you're medically incapable, then fine. I mean, keep your distance. But it's not about us, it's about loving our neighbour. Ancient Christians that I read quotes from, they went out into plagues. They helped people sick without any social distancing, without any masks, without any protection, without any vaccines. They just did it because that was the loving thing to do. And if we can't even have that attitude on a minor thing, how can we show that greater love to the wider world? So anyway, they are my theological thoughts for today. If you enjoyed the video, please share, like, leave a comment, and I'll put some of the links to the sources that I've read from in the description below. See you next time.